All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that's super important, especially if you're prepping for the UPSC exams.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic.
It's all about how India is like balancing this whole thing with building up its own defense capabilities, the whole Aatmanirbhar Bharat push. But at the same time, they got to work with other countries, form these partnerships. It's a real tightrope walk.
Absolutely. And this hits right at the heart of what's being discussed in UPSC Main's current affairs right now,
Yeah.
daily. And trust me, the core concepts here, they're gold for prelims too. It's that whole tension between needing to be self-reliant in defense, but also realizing there are some serious advantages to teaming up with, say, the U.S. for some of that high-end military tech. Of course, there are potential downsides too.
Exactly. And for anyone deep in the UPSC syllabus, this isn't just some abstract policy debate. It has real-world implications for how you answer those mains questions and how you pick out the key facts in prelims. Think about it. Questions on defense procurement, international relations, technology transfer, it all comes together here.
Oh, sure.
So what we're going to do today is try to cut through all the jargon and really get into the nitty-gritty. What's India's current approach to buying defense equipment? What's the deal with this U.S. partnership? And why is this idea of strategic autonomy so crucial for India?
Great plan.
We're leaning heavily on the Indian Express for a lot of our info today, so ready to dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, first things first. Got to understand where India stands right now, defense-wise.
Right. Okay, so Superpowers, they've got the data, and it paints a pretty clear picture. India is the world's second biggest arms importer. Now, you might think, whoa, that's a lot of reliance, and you'd be right. But there's been a bit of a shift recently. Between 2015 and 2019, imports actually went down like 9.3%. So maybe that's a sign we're moving towards self-reliance, right?
Yeah, at first glance, it does kind of seem like it, doesn't it?
Right.
But here's where it gets interesting. Even with that reduction, India still really depends on other countries for the really advanced, super high-tech stuff, the cutting-edge fighter jets, top-of-the-line missile defense systems, the equipment that really gives you a strategic advantage.
Exactly. And if you really dissect that 9.3% drop, you'll see it was mostly in older systems and spare parts. The need for those critical advanced technologies, things like sophisticated radar and electronic warfare systems, we're still mostly importing those.
Makes you think.
Right. So it shows that while the overall amount we're importing might be going down, we're still quite dependent on foreign expertise for certain strategic capabilities. And that brings us to our own defense industry, right? Particularly the DPSUs, the defense public sector undertakings. Aatmanirbhar Bharat, that's put a huge emphasis on them stepping up their game.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of Aatmanirbhar Bharat when it comes to defense is to make more of that military hardware right here in India. Less reliance on imports, more self-sufficiency. But let's be real, there have been some, shall we say, challenges in getting there as quickly as we might want. The Indian Air Force, for example, they've had a tough time keeping up their operational strength, and part of that's been because of the production rates at HAL, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. They've been, slower than hoped.
Yeah, no, that's a key point. And while we're investing big time in indigenous fighter programs, the Tejas NK-1A, the more advanced MK-2, and the AMCA, that really ambitious advanced medium combat aircraft, well, there's a detail we got to factor in. These are the future of our air power, but they need engines. And those engines, they're made in the U.S. We're talking about the General Electric F414 engines.
So hold on, the plane itself, the airframe, that's Indian design, the Indian build, but a core part, the engine that's coming from across the Pacific. Doesn't that mean we're still kind of reliant on decisions made in Washington? I mean, imagine building a super high-end car, but needing another country to make the engine. You're still, to some extent, at their mercy, right? Their supply chain, their strategic calculations. And what about upgrading the airframe later on? Does relying on that engine limit our ability to do that independently?
That's a really sharp observation. And the answer is yes, it can. See, we own the intellectual property for the airframe design. But if we want to make big changes that touch the engine systems, well, we'd probably need to talk to the engine manufacturer, maybe even get their approval.
Makes sense.
It's a subtle point about self-reliance. It's not just building the thing. It's about having control over those core subsystems and how they evolve. And speaking of the bigger picture, we got to remember, Russia is still a big supplier for India. Like a solid 36% of our arms imports come from them. So for India's strategic planners, there's a big question. How do we diversify our sources? Not just to be less reliant on one country, but also to make sure we're always getting the latest, most relevant tech out there.
Okay, so we've laid out where India stands. Major arms importer, trying to boost domestic production, still relying on foreign tech for key systems, and that long-standing dependence on Russia is still there. Now, let's talk about this whole defense relationship with the US. It's evolving, that's for sure. But is it a game changer for India? Or could it be, as we put it, a double-edged sword?
It's a relationship packed with potential, that's for sure, but with potential risks, too. We need to tread carefully. You've got initiatives like DTTI, the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative. They're meant to boost collaboration, making it easier to transfer advanced defense tech between our two countries. The whole idea with DTTI is to go beyond just buying and selling weapons. It's about deeper technological collaboration, co-developing, and co-producing equipment. But, and this is important, it's still just potential. We'll have to see what the long-term impact is, how much tech transfer actually happens. A lot depends on, well, a lot of things.
And you brought up something really important earlier. U.S. foreign policy can be unpredictable. We've seen administrations change and their priorities shift, sometimes drastically. So if you have what you might call a transactional administration, one that's all about what's in it for them right now, this very minute, where does that leave a long-term strategic partnership like the one India is trying to build in defense?
This is where Professor Anna Simons's idea of mutual indispensability is so relevant. She says a truly strong partnership isn't just about shared interests. It's about each side actually needing the other to reach their core strategic goals. Now, for you, our listeners getting ready for your UPSC exams, here's a key question. Is India truly indispensable to the U.S. in the same way as, say, a NATO ally or some of their long-standing partners?
It's a powerful way to look at this relationship because let's be honest, India's role in Washington's global strategy, it's definitely growing, but it can still seem kind of fluid depending on what's happening in the world. We're important for countering China in the Indo-Pacific, for example. But that strategic imperative, it could change as the whole regional dynamic shifts. And as you said, that fluidity, it's risky if India becomes too reliant on the U.S. for its defense.
You got it. If you depend too much on a partner whose commitment might change with the wind, you could find yourself in a vulnerable spot, especially when it comes to staying ahead technologically and making sure your military is ready for anything. International relations, especially when it comes to defense, well, interests can align and then drift apart pretty quickly. It's a reminder.
So if the U.S. partnership has these question marks, what can India learn from its other defense relationships? The ones you mentioned, Russia, Israel, France. What do those alternative models tell us?
They offer some great insights, for sure. Take Russia, for example. Even with everything that's been going on globally and India's push to diversify, Russia has been a steady, mostly reliable supplier of key equipment for decades. I'm talking about frontline fighters like the Su-30, advanced missile systems like the S-400. That consistency, even with its own limitations, it's given India a sense of reliability, something we've come to depend on.
And then there's Israel, much smaller country, but a world leader in specific defense tech, right? Especially missile defense and advanced surveillance. And they've been more willing to share cutting-edge technology with India in these areas.
That's right. And France, with deals like the Rafale fighter jets, they've shown they can be a solid partner too. Often, they're more open to deeper technological cooperation, even transferring some tech, like the Rafale deal. That had specific commitments on technology transfer. It's this kind of partnership, focusing on co-creation, shared advancement, that's a valuable lesson for India as we look to build stronger, more mutually beneficial defense relationships in the future. The big takeaway here, when you compare all these partnerships, is that we got to really look at what each relationship is built on. Is it this deep, long-term, we need each other kind of thing, where both countries see the other as essential for reaching their big strategic goals? Or is it more about short-term gains, just as long as both sides are getting what they need right now?
That difference between long-term alignment and those short-term deals, it feels super important. And it brings us to that cautionary tale you mentioned, the U.S.-Pakistan alliance. Can you unpack that a bit? Why is that a potential warning for India?
Well, that alliance, back in the Cold War, it happened because of a very specific situation. The U.S. and Pakistan, they had a shared goal,
Right.
counter the Soviet Union in the region. But when Pakistan wasn't so strategically important to Washington anymore, after the Cold War ended and they had other priorities, that alliance started to unravel. The flow of military aid, economic support, it dried up. The whole relationship got strained, even hostile at times. It's a stark reminder that relying too much on a partner whose interests might not always align with yours, well, it can backfire.
Yeah,
So the question is, could India find itself in a similar situation down the road if we're not careful?
a sobering thought for sure. So given all this, the potential upside, the potential downsides, the uncertainty of international partnerships, what's the best way for India to protect its strategic autonomy moving forward? What needs to happen?
It's a multi-pronged approach, as our outline highlights. First off, diversifying our sources for defense tech and equipment. That's absolutely essential. We've talked about Russia, the growing relationship with the U.S., but India needs to be proactive. Explore relationships with other countries that have what we need, countries that can be reliable long-term partners.
And that diversification strategy, it's got to go hand in hand with a real push for technology transfer and homegrown innovation in defense. We talked about the GE F414 engine deal, that's one example. But what makes the technology transfer truly beneficial? Something that empowers India in the long run, not just another purchase.
It's about going beyond just buying a finished product. Real technology transfer means getting the know-how, the intellectual property rights, building up our ability to manufacture locally, maintain the equipment, even upgrade and develop it further down the line. It's about creating lasting capability here, not being a forever customer. And for that, we need serious investment in our defense R&D. Stronger collaboration between the private sector, the DPSUs, universities, research institutions, a thriving innovation ecosystem right here in India.
For sure. And that leads us to strengthening our own indigenous defense capabilities across the board. It's not just about fighter jets. It's about meeting all our defense needs through Indian innovation, Indian production.
Exactly. We need to ramp up development of everything.
Yeah.
Sophisticated missile defense systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, cutting-edge cyber warfare capabilities, the whole spectrum. When we build that capacity here, we're less vulnerable to disruptions in the global supply chain, less affected by the political whims of other countries.
And in this ever-changing geopolitical landscape, being able to adapt quickly is key. If you're too reliant on one partner, you're vulnerable to their internal politics, changes in their priorities.
Right, absolutely. The U.S.-India defense relationship, it's got potential, but it operates within the context of U.S. politics.
Yeah.
A new administration, they can, and often do, change things up. So India needs a smart strategy, multi-alignment, build strong ties with multiple global powers while always strengthening our own defense industry. That's a good hedge against sudden unfavorable policy changes from any one partner.
And two more things we got to think about. Strategic defense planning, with a focus on self-sufficiency, and taking steps to protect our interests if our partners change their policies.
So important. Being self-sufficient in logistics, having resilient supply chains for crucial components, being able to maintain our weapons without relying on foreign contractors every time that's non-negotiable for true strategic autonomy. And India needs to be proactive about mitigating those policy shifts. Maybe stockpiling critical components, developing multiple sources for key technologies, having solid contingency plans in place. It's about being prepared.
So, big picture. India is walking this tightrope, leveraging partnerships, especially with the U.S., to get the advanced tech we need, but at the same time, protecting our strategic autonomy, building up our own defense industry. A real balancing act.
You nailed it. And for our listeners out there working hard for those UPSC exams, understanding all these nuances is crucial. Defense, foreign policy, national security, they're all intertwined. It's a recurring theme in your syllabus. For mains, for prelims, it's all connected.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to ponder. Given everything we've talked about today, what do you think will be the biggest factor influencing India's quest for true strategic autonomy in the next decade? Will it be successful tech transfer, diversifying our partnerships, a stronger defense R&D ecosystem in India, or something else entirely? Really think about it.
It's a complex landscape, and we hope this deep dive has given you some clarity, some key insights. And for all you dedicated UPSC aspirants, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive. We'll be back with more in-depth discussions on topics that matter to you. And hey, leave a comment if you have any questions or thoughts. We love hearing from you.
And just to be clear, our main source for today's discussion was the Indian Express. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.